Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Fall Out Boy, titled American Beauty, American Psycho. I don't think that anybody knew what to expect when Fall Out Boy dropped their long-awaited comeback record, Save Rock and Roll, back in 2013. Now, this is a band that was simultaneously fanatically loved and hated. There wasn't exactly a lot of middle ground with these guys. Yeah, the instrumentation had bombast and tight, groove-flavored melodies, but they were also clearly riding the coattails of the pop-flavored emo movement, so they got lumped into that crowd. Yeah, Patrick Stump had a great voice when it wasn't screamingly obnoxious. And yeah, the lyrics were intricate and poetic, and Pete Wentz was a gifted songwriter, but going beneath the surface revealed a lot of arrogance and self-obsession and a bad tendency to behave like condescending assholes. And you know what? The funny thing is that all that is true, and yet as a critic, I'm inclined to give a little bit of the edge to Fall Out Boy here. For as much as they played assholes, they were at least aware of it in their framing, and it wasn't as if they didn't occasionally make some solid points, especially when they started drifting towards political material. And frankly, the more bombastic and experimental they got, the more I could appreciate them, especially with their underrated concept album Folie à Deux. So when they came back in 2013, I was excited to see some grander ambition, and then okay, look, I know from a certain academic standpoint, Save Rock and Roll by Fall Out Boy doesn't really work all the way through. It's over the top to the point of self-important silliness. It makes grand statements it can't back up. The production is a total mess. The majority of the guest stars flat out do not work. It frequently pulls from other mainstream rock acts, and the fact that a massive portion of it is a middle finger to their own fans was probably not the best of creative choices, and that's not even getting into the video. And yet, of all the albums that I've covered in 2013 in written or video form, it's been the record I've come back to the most ever since. Definitely not because it's the best, but because it's downright fascinating for me and contains some of the band's best ever songs. And while the targets of some of their rage might be misplaced, you can't exactly deny that the band was throwing their all into this record, for better or for worse, and I can kind of respect that. So as such, I had no idea what to expect from their newest album, American Beauty, American Psycho. On the one hand, Fall Out Boy were claiming to be even more experimental and tackle more political material, which didn't really happen, but whatever. But on the other hand, I found the new single Centuries to be kind of underwhelming and really reminiscent of Panic at the Disco's Miss Jackson, at least on the first few listens, mostly because it got the same female singer for the song. But you know what? I'm still somewhat a fan of Fall Out Boy, so I made sure to give this album a fair few listens. What do we get here? Well, just like Save Rock and Roll, it's something of a complete overloaded mess that doesn't really work. But unlike that album, I don't really see American Beauty, American Psycho holding up. I'm not going to begrudge Fall Out Boy for taking a risk with this, but the results were a lot more mixed than they were back in 2013, and a lot of it is reflecting a band that's struggling to find their place in modern music, specifically in rock. And while there are definitely great moments on this album that I do like, the lack of a solid unifying theme or real message to drive it all together means this album starts falling apart at the seams the second you start digging into its meat. So okay, let's start with the acknowledgement that Fall Out Boy, from melodic composition to Patrick Stump's vocal delivery to Pete Wentz's songwriting, all it produces the foundations of a good band, even at their most screamingly obnoxious. And honestly, they don't hit that point as often as usual on this album, which is saying something. They're still a talented and versatile rock group, and considering that this record was designed for more fist-pumping anthems and arenas, it makes sense that they'd be looking for any way they possibly could amp up the bombast and grandeur and raw power. And they did that, but I'm not sure they did it well. Instead of thickening the bass or going for a heavier guitar tone or adding some more blackened textures, Fall Out Boy instead shoved the sizzle of the guitar right to the front of the mix and threw together as much hammering, noisy percussion as they could possibly get. And to give Fall Out Boy credit here, they did at least fight to make sure there was a melody line at least somewhere visible lost through the cacophony to drive the tracks along with Patrick Stump's howls, whether it be through a strident guitar lick, keyboards, or even horns. And yet, I can't say I'm a huge fan of this overall approach, mostly because instead of letting the melody or the groove drive the heaviness, it's this wall of sound that feels very clumsily mixed, almost loud enough to swallow the vocals, so in response they piled fuzzes and filters all over Patrick Stump that match the production, the majority of which he just doesn't need. It doesn't sound good. What it leads to are songs with verses that are very melodic, almost even beautiful at points, and yet with choruses that are all overexposed, rough edges, and overloaded mixes, and I'm sorry, it just feels really forced to me. Now that's not saying that there aren't songs that can kind of make this work. The rich horns of Irresistible, the eerie sample from Tom's Diner by Susan Vega that drives centuries, of which I've actually warmed to a fair bit, the whistle and prominent bass line of The Kids Aren't Alright, the piano and bells of Jetpack Blues, I really like that, the dirty pummeling crunch of Novocaine, definitely like that, the spunky summer vibe of Favorite Record, and especially the fluttering piano and sampled guitar and horns of Uma Thurman. These are sampled from the Munsters theme. In fact, if we're looking for Fall Out Boy's biggest innovation on this album, one that shouldn't be any surprise whatsoever when you see this album has production credits from J.R. Rodham, it's in the sampling. So, is it a bad thing when I say that despite how great some of the samples might be, there are cases where I might prefer the samples on their own over to what Fall Out Boy does to them? Because when we look at the title track that samples Motley Crue's Too Fast for Love, it sounds like an overloaded mess. Like everything else on this album, there's no subtlety in the sample. It just feels so slapdash. Granted, it's not the only place this album feels slapdash. Immortals has this reedy flute opening that feels completely out of place with everything except the weedy vocal production, which doesn't sound good whatsoever, even despite the heavier crunch of the guitars. Really probably the weakest song on this album. Now, of course, all this could be overlooked if the lyrics held up. And if we're looking for an area where the lack of direction is really standing out, it's here. Now, sure, Pete Wentz is still a good songwriter with a gift for interesting lyrics and metaphors that can make up for some sloppy songwriting at points, repeating words or stuttering syllables to fill up space. He really does it a lot more than you might think, and you start noticing it pretty frequently. And on first glance, the songs all seem to fit into the standard Fall Out Boy template. Troubled/fragmented relationships, a middle finger at the establishment with a vaguely populist vibe, and towering arrogance that's just punctured enough with enough self-awareness to make it palatable. Hell, on some level, it falls very much in line with Save Rock and Roll. But the big difference is that American Beauty, American Psycho doesn't seem to have the same unifying themes that that previous record had. Now, sure, the hyperbolic rage of Save Rock and Roll and the whole theme of it all to Save Rock and Roll, it was ridiculous. But Fall Out Boy knew that, and they were still committed to it anyway. An album exploring what it was going to be like for one of the few rock bands that could be huge in the mainstream anymore, and what it would mean to win back a fan base that had largely thrown them aside, and how you'd want to try to win them back whether they're worth it at all. And you know what? The more times I listened through this album, it felt very much like a now what record. The big struggle had been fought and won with Save Rock and Roll, so now what was Fall Out Boy gonna do? Well, if we're gonna stretch for a theme, and believe me it's a stretch, it'd probably be tied to Fall Out Boy's thoughts surrounding legacy and where their band stands to go now. And what I kind of appreciate about this album is that Fall Out Boy doesn't really provide a straightforward answer to that question. They got songs where they might say they might go on for centuries, but it's undercut by the constant question of whether or not they themselves are worth that long-term recognition. Very much in vain of what they think they were worthy enough to save rock and roll on their last record, which was a constant question. And at the very end of the album, we're left with a similar non-sequitur answer as before, where ultimately those larger questions might not even matter, as long as some brand of imperfect love can be found. And you know what? On some level, that all kind of makes sense. The Pulp Fiction references strewn across the record, the callback to Sid Vicious's doomed relationship with Nancy Spungen, even if the larger whole might be diseased or broken or might not add up to much, it's the little moments of love and details, the personal touches, are what really matters. In other words, it's not really all about the briefcase. But you know what? While that's a good theme, I can't help but feel that it might be a little bit misplaced for a record that sounds like this with this presentation. Fall Out Boy was aiming to go bigger, louder, and even more broad on this record, and undercutting all of that bombast surrounding legacy by implying that it's not nearly as relevant as holding on to fragments of love. It strikes me as a very Fall Out Boy thing to say, but it's not exactly handled well when none of the quiet moments you need to accentuate that point had any quiet or restraint to them at all. Which means for an album as a whole, man, I'm conflicted on this. Like it or not, I still like the majority of the songs on this album with few exceptions, but whenever I try to really get deep into this record beyond, say, Uma Thurman, Jetpack Blues, or Novocaine, I get waist deep into nitpicks and problems that I can't really ignore. And I know that I prefer it when Fall Out Boy gets more conceptual, and they clearly weren't trying to do that with this album. But this record seems to be trying to force the drama when it's just not there, and that bugs me a lot. So for me, I'm going to give this album a very strong 6 out of 10 and recommendation. If you're a hardcore Fall Out Boy fan, of course you're going to like this album. But beyond that, well, check out a few songs beyond the singles to be sure. But if that doesn't win you over, it's probably not for you. It happens. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Voice is a little bit hoarse right now, probably because I've been coughing all day. Lovely. Until then, if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'm more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.